Set 5, Triumphant Return of the Brave Heroes, and Lyrical Set 2, It's a New School Term, have released with a questionable impact on Overdress as a whole. These sets introduced a whopping 8 new decks into the game, and for the most part, left the metagame alone. There were a few interesting implications of the scarce meta cards in these sets for this tier list. Let's get right onto it with the bottom tier. Here are the Abyss decks. Decks here are so insanely far behind, they are practically unable to function in the modern game. For right now, the only inhabitant are the 5 Touken Ranbu decks. I say it a lot with this game, but I still dislike how Bushiroad releases these half-developed crossover sets just to leave them to suffer. At least give the deck a promo that's better than Counterblast Soul Blast one, give a unit 10k. I want to be able to play these decks with my friends, but every Touken Ranbu playstyle can just be found in other decks with significantly better cards. I feel so bad for the decks in E tier. Bushiroad just really didn't want these decks to do anything, so they haven't given them any decent support. Hermina is held down by the poorly designed nature of the Powerful mechanic. Powerful requires you to have no open Counterblast or Soul Blast to use its effects. There's a joke here about how power for power's sake is hollow, but I feel like making that joke would be more effort than Bushiroad put into designing the deck. So Powerful needs to spend all of its resources to play the game. However, its main cards still require resources to do stuff. What should be a unique deck all around playing around minimal resources becomes a mess of mediocre effects the deck can't afford to play, leaving the deck anything but powerful. I love Eugene, but 3 attacks at minimal power with hard to use criticals only on the Vanguard leaves the deck very close to falling into the abyss. The only thing holding up this deck is the ability to draw a ridiculous amount of cards for retiring units. However, the entire nation of Thegrea gets counters to retiring, leaving Eugene in an auto-lose situation. Eugene also struggles to hit decent numbers, and the Eugene check top 5 mechanic can lead the deck out. It's so sad that Bushiroad didn't even give this deck a retrain in the upcoming festival collection, like the other 3 set 1 ride lines. Majesty Lord Blaster asks the question, if a deck can spam enough blaster cards, can it be meta? The answer is unsurprisingly no. Unfortunately, the deck is locked into 3 attacks, even if it does get some extra drive checks. It requires some luck to do well with this deck, and while the deck can easily search a ton of blasters to set up for Vanguard skill, the skill itself is still super costly, leaving the deck to lean heavily on generic Keter support for value. But that's not enough. D-tier decks are mostly like halfway thought out decks. You can feel where the idea was going, but Bushiroad clearly didn't want to actually commit to them, as it is within expectations that these decks don't function nearly as well as the top end. First off, we have Greedon, who's kind of always been just okay in Overdress, despite being really strong in Premium. The deck's skills are just too costly to use effectively, and the 3 to 4 attacks the deck makes are too slow in the current meta. Eventually, Greedon will get something that breaks him, but there's no telling how long that could take. Overall, Greedon is a fair bit underpowered, but taking 6 damage is fun. Wilista got infinitely better than where it was pre-set 2. Unfortunately, infinity times 0 is still 0. Wilista is a 4 attack deck that's trying to wombo combo out a full board and draw a bunch of cards while trying not to deck itself out. The best builds of this deck are inconsistent, and the consistent builds of this deck do almost nothing. Ultimately, this deck will just get powered through by every higher deck. Hexaorb is a deck of solid effects that are ridiculously overcosted. In Hexaorb, a counterblast to stack the top deck is good, while in Lyrical Monasterio, that effect is given for free to a rearguard. There is a lot of unique techs this deck can do to make up for its issues, such as one Lag Rail for an extra drive checks, or Maple for consistent access to a unit. While Hexaorb can still high roll, opponents' decks overall are getting more and more resistant to higher numbers. Orfist is still exactly where it was after set 3, and that's just sad. Instead of giving it new support to aid the deck, what support the deck did get is middle of the road and completely different than what the strategy needs. Orfist still has a solid early rush, even if it's not as good as it once was. Orfist can't make it to the late game, even if it sorta wants to. Orfist is still the deck which can't make enough tokens to use all the effects it wants. The new token promo doesn't fix enough, and it came way too late to matter. Well, at least the new Orfist Grade 3 revealed in the Festival Collection is okay, even if it is a bit slow. Dragonic Overlord The End didn't really get a lot set 5. Despite the marketing, Overlord only got 2 new cards, Overlord the End and a new Searcher. There's some generic support the deck takes advantage of, and a lot of the techs you run are just a band-aid for the lack of a soul. At least with Overlord the End, the deck can actually get a true 4 attacks. It's just, why play Overlord in Dragon Empire when you could play Overlord in Lyrical Monasterio? Eva is a set order-based value deck that's all about using a variety of research orders to handle any situation. Unfortunately, Bushiroad decided to only release 1 research, so the deck is just flat out unfinished. The deck is a solid 4 attack deck, where its rearguard can gain extra attack and crits. The researcher deck does have is both a hand filter and a binding removal option. This deck has a fair bit of potential, it's just too bad Bushiroad forgot to finish releasing its cards. Set B are the middle of the road kind of decks. There's a lot of lyrical decks out there, as well as all the non-Magnolia Stokea decks. Rorowa is a weird offspring of Neonectar that's just a little too janky to take advantage of the good things it can do. The deck spams out little plant tokens for little cost, which are used to trigger effects. This can be anything from setting up an extra back row attack to getting free guard on your opponent's attacks. These are very solid effects, and when they work, they can hit pretty hard. It's just the deck needs to see its pieces. Well, more so the issue is the limited number of rearguard circles the deck has to place its plants. If the deck wants to commit to max attacks, it's not getting more than 2 tokens for defense. If the deck wants max guards, have fun swinging with 10k token columns. Overall, the deck is very meh, but it is pretty flexible. Zorga is still out here being an okay toolbox deck. This deck has a super high skill ceiling and has to do so much more just to end up doing less than every other higher deck. Zorga is still hard locked in the 3 attacks, even if it can give each of those attacks crit. Roaming Prison Dragons threatens continued pressure, and the deck can get orders right out of the deck. Honestly, if you want to play Zorga, just play Mega Colony in Premium. If the Japanese ban list is anything to go by, you should be fine. Flagburg is surprisingly okay, in that Pulse Dragon fixes a lot of issues with the deck. It's a lot more consistent to get 5 attacks on turn 3, and it can actually get soul now. The downsides are very apparent though. The deck doesn't hit large numbers even with the Persona Ride, and the deck can very easily run out of soul and burn out on effects. It is a very solid rush deck, but at the end of the day, it's just weaker Magnolia. Clarissa didn't actually get anything from set 2 of Lyrical outside of new triggers. This means while the deck's main gimmick is still really solid, the deck as a whole falls behind. The deck loses hard to Prison. Also, even if Clarissa can hard punish Magnolia, Magnolia will always win the match because of just how insane the value is. Bushiroad, next time don't be lazy and give us new Earns Correct units. Oh, wait a minute. We're getting 6 new ride lines in the next lyrical set. Yay! More unfinished garbage decks. Feltyrosa has a lot of her consistency issues from set 1 fixed. The goal of this deck is the same. Chain drive checks together to get 5+ attacks. The deck gets better control over its boosters, and has more chances of hitting a decent front row unit for Feltyrosa's skill. Unfortunately, the deck can still low roll. The stacking it does already do is okay, but it would be better if it didn't have to. I wish this deck had gotten triple drive instead of Kairi. Alestiel has switched to being based around Black Wings this set. What this deck does now is try to decrease the opponent's Vanguard power to 0, then use its new units to attack from back row. Alestiel now has an amazing new consistency rear guard that lets us choose what card is in the bind zone. This can also be used as hand filtering. Since the deck is now focused on Black Wings, it is now a lot more consistent. The deck is fine, although you might be better playing the support with Kairi as your grade 3 instead of Alestiel. Mimish Fortia, or Friends, is a Dragonic Overlord deck, but in Lyrical Monasterio, meaning it has the early aggression of Dragonic Overlord with a restanding Vanguard, but with higher numbers on the rear guards and a whole lot more draw power. The Friends units hit super high numbers and can enable self-bouncing for a bit of playing around retiring. It's also got a ride line that sets up the deck super well. All around, it's solid and very fair. But fair and solid don't make a meta deck, so it sits in B tier. I'm super proud of my boy Phantom Blaster Dragon for finally becoming decent. Overlord gives the deck access to multi-attacks, while the older miscellaneous support for the deck enables a lot of free value. The big new card this deck gets is Skull Witch Nemain, who's a Counterblast 1, put a card in the soul and draw 2. That's nuts and helps deal with so much of today's meta. It does only swing for 10k, but that's fine. The deck is also able to make use of generic Kita support for draws, checking the top deck, or recursion. Typically, the deck will hit the Phantom Blaster Dragon and Soul skill by just using skills to put it into Soul. It's super cool, but a lack of more keeps this deck in a very mid position on the tier list. Thegrea is a weird one. Her gimmick is all about riding a light and dark Vanguard on top of each other to get different effects. The light Vanguard is a Bastion effect that can also look for units from top deck. The dark Vanguard has removal options and is Dragonic Overlord. These let the strategy change according to a preset order of units. Typically, the light grade 3 into a dark into a light. Outside of that, the deck is really just trying to get as much generic value as possible. Maybe, for example, lets it call itself for free. The deck also abuses generic Keter support to try and call as many units as possible for free plays. If the deck had more attacks on turn 3, it would be ranked higher. Unfortunately, being popular doesn't make your deck good. B tier is where we start to see our competitive contenders. These decks in B tier are what you'd call rogue. I've seen a lot of these played in Seat B at every event I go to. First off, we have Loronerol. It's still the exact same deck it was from set 1, but now it has better guard thanks to triggers. The new support it has doesn't even make it into the deck due to its Soul Blast cost and because its effects are tied to specific orders being used. This means it's better to just run generic plus 5k cards. Loronerol can still blow out decks if the opponent doesn't understand its crit gaining guard restrict Vanguard. The deck is still also crazy for finding value. I wouldn't count out Loronerol. Grade 3 Bruce is still topping, keeping it relevant as an alternative to Grade 4 Bruce. It's all about using Leonard to punish our opponent for having rear guards. The strategy can come down hard against decks like Magnolia and Prison. The biggest issue with the deck is how it's less game ending immediately than its counterpart and loses out on the little early pressure Bruce can get in the other variant. It's more grind game than blowout, and decks like Prison and Magnolia can punish players for trying that if their final rush turn isn't enough. Play grade 3 Bruce if you want a more skilled experience. Nirvana is an amazing deck based around controlling the tempo of the game and going all in whenever the Nirvana player wants to. Nirvana gets amazing draws thanks to Verena arcs, and the deck can deal free damage thanks to its grade 4. The deck gets 5 attacks on turn 4 with absolutely massive numbers, and it can swing for big numbers with crits on turn 3. The downside to the deck is it is extremely vulnerable to removal, and the deck is counterblast heavy. More so than that, this deck takes a lot of game knowledge, and it's on the player to figure out what pace they should put the game at. Is it better to wait until turn 4 to commit to aggression, or do we need to come swinging right out of the gate? Grade 4 Bruce is a simple deck all about stacking 3 crits on the Vanguard and having it restand. It's a very simple double PG or GG deck. The downside to this deck is it has to make it to turn 4 for it to try its win con. And while this deck is trying to live, an opponent can amass a lot of cards in hand. This means what Bruce is good at is bullying bad players. A good opponent will not give Bruce a chance to win, but a bad player will fall into Bruce's traps, like having Iden swing with the crit because they went to 4 damage. If Bruce had a better matchup into Prison and wasn't so dependent on going first, it could easily be higher, but for right now it is stuck here. Near the top of B tier, we have Baromagnes, a simple 5 attacks on turn 3 with one of the best board wipes in the game. Baromagnes has been given tools to play into grind games, and it unfortunately needs them, as most decks have gotten a lot better at surviving Baromagnes' big blowout turns. This leaves Baromagnes a lot more dependent on using its soul as a toolbox to outmaneuver the opponent and win tempo. While what the deck does is strong, it does get out aggroed a little early, and it's just not doing enough to be higher. Lastly, we have the newcomer, Tamayura. Tamayura comes out swinging with an easy 5 attacks on turn 3, or 4 attacks calling out anything in soul. Tamayura also gives plus 5k to everything on her turn 4, so with Persona Rides, it's plus 15k. So she has a very solid rush, and she scales a bit, which helps keep her above a deck like Flagburg. What makes Tamayura so strong is all about the flexibility she has on top of her 5 attack base. Her 2 Magia Doll units give either a draw or put one in the soul for the cost of Soul Blast 2. The deck also has one of the best defensive orders in the game, being a straight up Soul Blast 2 for minus 10k to the opponent's front row. And lastly, the deck has a grade 1 searcher that can search any Stealth Fiend card or the dolls. Stealth units in the deck include not only this deck's recursion, but also the brand new heal trigger. This deck is insane and lets a good player show off their skills, but what keeps the deck lower is its inability to actually get enough soul for its skills. It forces a player to be a lot more conservative with how they play, and that's a shame, because this deck could do a lot. Here we have the big contenders for the format. These decks see some of the most tops in the game. If you care about playing competitively, you should understand how these decks work. Moving up a tier, we have Gravidia. This deck threatens both a complete board wipe every turn, and game as well. The ability to constantly board wipe gives a favorable matchup against decks like Prison, Bastion, Tamayura, and Nirvana. But what's really notable about Gravidia is its ability to double trigger effects. A double crit can immediately get a game win against an opponent with a weaker hand, and a double heal can immediately get rid of any pressure the opponent would have had. So the deck gets free control pressure and always threatens game if a player gets lucky. This deck gets a free draw 2 and an optional still charge 2 every time the grade 3 is written. Gravidia can also use the Orfist raid line for a 20k attacker on turn 2. What hurts the deck is, well, low rolling. At the core, Gravidia is only a 3 attack deck, despite how obnoxious the deck can be to play against. If Gravidia doesn't get super lucky, or can't always retire 3 units, Gravidia will eventually run out of steam and lose. Kairi is the only deck that got super strong from the new support in set 2 of Lyrical Monasterio, and honestly, I am halfway convinced it wasn't intentional. What Kairi does is set up for a large 5 attacks on turn 4, while drawing ridiculous numbers of cards all the way through. The deck also benefits from triple drive and a card to stack top deck. With the Lyrical Overtrigger existing, this is insane. Kairi is also able to do a lot of self-bouncing on turn 3. This helps play around decks like Prison and Bags of Vargra. The Friends engine is where Kairi gets her draws from. It's a simple collection of cards that when placed get draws. This all in all adds up to what is a very scary deck that's straight up from the Bermuda. Here we have the S tier decks. These 2 decks warp the entire format around them, and surprise, it's the same 2 decks as it was last time, and it's likely to be for a while. Seraph Snow is the best deck at abusing almost every deck in the game, except for a Magnolia. Seraph Snow rips cards out of the opponent's hand, punishes them for calling a board, and gets massive buffs for doing it. Being able to imprison units from the soul kneecaps decks like Kairi and Tamayura. The decks imprisoning from field kneecaps decks like Bastion and Nirvana. The deck's imprisoning from hand messes with decks like Baromagnes, Bruce, and Loronerol. Funnily enough, all these things either don't affect Magnolia or actively help it. Prison is also unique, as it also has so many extra sources of draw power. Chevalstud is a Counterblast Soul Blast draw card. Seraph Snow Grade 3 has triple drive. Seraph Snow can aggro if it wants to without challenge, and Seraph Snow can grind thanks to the number it hits from the Grade 4's buffs. Seraph Snow is all about getting good value, while also removing an opponent's ability to play the game. Lastly, that brings us to the best deck in the format, Magnolia. Magnolia is able to come out swinging with an extremely consistent 6 attacks on turn 4 and 4 attacks on turn 3. Inlet Pulse Dragons solves 3 of the deck's biggest problems, simultaneously filling Soul, drawing a card, and getting a unit off the board. He also gets to be called out of Soul by the Grade 4 Vanguard skill. What's more about Magnolia is the card Genosula can move power around to make triggers extra powerful, and Gabrek has card restrict. It's extremely funny to swing in the backs of Vargo players with an unblockable attack. Inpix gives the deck access to protection on those Grade 3 turns, and an option for protection on Grade 4 and higher turns. The deck can play both aggressively and as a more tempo type playstyle. This deck has it all, and more importantly, it hard counters the second best deck in the game, Seraph Snow. While Magnolia has less strong matchups against other decks in the game, Magnolia is bordering on a nearly 90% win rate against Prison, making this deck the best choice to take in the tournaments, as it doesn't really have a lot of bad matchups. That's all for the deck tier list of the video, but here's a new segment where I rank each nation's generic support. At the top, we have Lyrical Monasterio and Keter Sanctuary. Lyrical support is a free variety of draws and playing for units. It's so good that a single rearguard booster does everything Hexaorb does, but without a real cost. This generic support is one of the reasons why Kairi is super good. Keter support is also really good at getting free units and putting stuff in the soul. It also has access to a lot of free grade 3 support thanks to Bastion stuff. Flagburg is extra drive checks for any deck that wants it. Also, Fusado is an option that exists for countercharging and soul charging. Free options are abundant in Keter. Stoicheia has 2 things going for its generic support: Inlet Pulse Dragon and its wide array of orders. These orders give access to retiring recursion and extra power gain. Where these effects aren't as strong as Keter and Lyrical stuff, all the decks in Stoicheia can make a lot of use of them. Brant Gate has a lot of good stuff, like the Orfist order. It also has a lot of really good counterchargers that none of the decks really need to use. The nation also has a lot of order searching, even if none of the major decks particularly need it. That's the big issue with generic Brant Gate support. It's strong, but not really needed. Dark States are really good at soul charging cards, and that's mostly it. Luckily, every deck in Dark States is about soul charging, so it kinda works out. Dragon Empire needs some love. Most decks used to be able to steal Overdress support, but it's kind of been power crept out of the game. Generic Dragon Empire's gimmick is soul charging all for discarding and writing cards. The decks in Dragon Empire do need that, but it's not really a lot. At least every other deck can make passable use of Eugene support, even if Eugene support itself is very meh. Thanks for watching. Should be more exciting content coming out this week, so please subscribe if you want more. Leave a comment, it helps with the YouTube algorithm. It sucks to say it, but on a lot of these Vanguard videos, I'm competing with my older videos, and it's hard to break through sometimes. In any case, see you next time.